In this video, we'll look at the evolution of the baculum, also known as os penis or the penis bone. But first, some background. We know that reproductive organs often evolve much quicker than other morphology, probably because sexual selection can act in pretty much arbitrary directions, while natural selection is pretty restrictive. So often, the genital morphology is used to distinguish between otherwise very similar-looking species, like it's done in some snails, spiders, or bees. And different genital morphology is also oftentimes the cause for speciation, which may be related to the last point. And that diversity also holds true for mammals, because their most, but not all species do have a baculum, and this bone also varies a lot between them because it's mostly above the urethra, but in pandas it's below. And sometimes it fills the whole length of the penis, sometimes only a small part, and what the bone looks like on the inside is also very different between species. So with all of that diversity, there is still a big question about its purpose. The paper I'm presenting now nicely lists the current hypotheses with their predictions and the support for each of these predictions in this table. The hypotheses are that it protects the urethra during copulation, which has support in primates and some carnivores, but not in other carnivores. That the bone functions in the context of sperm competition, which may be true in rodents and carnivores, pinnipeds and mice, but not in bats, primates and other carnivores. That it stimulates the female to ovulate or implant, which is not supported in the only study that is looking at that hypothesis, and that it signals male quality, for which there is evidence in muskrats and seals, but not in martens, mice, and bats. So that's just a mess, honestly, and we don't really know anything right now. But why is this the case? Why do we see this pattern of not seeing a pattern? There are at least 4 hypotheses that might be explaining this. The first one is that we are not really looking at the right parameter of the baculum, which is usually the length in these studies. So rather it might be the width or the shape of it. The second hypothesis is that it fulfills different purposes in all those different groups. The third one is that evolution is so rapid that it outpaces any correlations between the baculum size and its effects. Although I myself am not really sure how that would work. And fourth, this paper tests the hypothesis that it evolved independently in different mammal groups, with all those groups having different evolutionary pressures and genetic constraints that make them all look very different. Again here, spoiler alert, this paper finds that the baculum was gained and lost multiple times during mammalian evolution. I chose this topic and paper because it exemplifies how erratic and non-obvious sexual selection can be. So how did they find this out? The authors first built a big phylogeny of mammals by essentially stitching together 5 other phylogenies, and then they assigned to each of these 954 species whether it currently possesses a baculum or not. This figure shows you in red the phyla that have one, and in blue those that don't. Unfortunately, I don't have access to a bigger, more detailed picture of this. So now that I wanted to know at which point in history which ancestor species gained a baculum and which ones lost it. So for example, did the ancestor of mammals as a whole have one, and then hundreds of species have lost it? Or did it arise independently in different lineages? And if yes, how often? Can we see any patterns in the phylogeny? So therefore, the team did something called stochastic mapping. And that just means that using some software, they assigned gains and losses to the tree so that it would make sense in some way. And then they did this 1,000 times. So in the end, if for example in 800 of these 1,000 trees, there was a gain at a certain point, for example, from one rodent to the next rodent split, then you can say with 80% probability that there was a gain there. But in phylogenetic work, there is always the problem of biases of which species are included in those trees. because some are just easier to study or are more charismatic. So the authors also checked for that. But the general results didn't change much, so I won't go into the details here. And these are the results in detail. Across these 1,000 trees, the baculum was on average gained 9.5 times and lost 11.5 times. And also controlling for the sampling bias shifts these numbers just a little bit downward. So, it happened a lot. The baculum is only found in eutherians, so it was probably not present in the ancestor of mammals. So now I'll go into some more details with a few clades of mammals. There were at least 2 gains in primates, in the ancestor of modern monkeys and the ancestor of lemurs. Then it was lost again 3 times, including once in humans, of course. Interestingly, the ancestor of rodents gained a baculum, and then its descendants never lost it. So that indicates that there is some evolutionary constraint in rodents that just lets them keep it. And of course, we don't really know what it is. Carnivores also gained a baculum, and then the bearcat and hyenas have lost it again. So maybe that also has something to do with the weird reproductive system of the hyena. We don't know. Another analysis they did was estimating the rates of speciation of those clades that did have a baculum and those that didn't. And the results for that are that phyla with a baculum diversify much more rapidly than those without. But the authors say that we need a better and less biased data set to confirm by how much this is the case. So with these results, there remain a few big open questions. On the mechanistic side, is it that there is just one genetic pathway that gets switched on and off whenever the baculum is gained and lost? Or are there novel genetic pathways recruited that build this bone from scratch, basically, with new genes? Another question is how the baculum affects sexual selection. So oftentimes, the male has evolved offensive strategies against the female defense, and even small differences in that can make a big impact on their reproductive success. We also know basically nothing about how the different genital anatomies work in situ, so that means which role the bones and other structures play in the act of copulation. In conclusion, this paper shows that there were quite a lot of independent gains and losses of the baculum in mammals, and that we still don't really know a lot about its function and the selective pressures that shape it. So I would say this is still a really rich field for biologists to explore. So with that, until next time, keep your ears stiff.